Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Megan Gorman, the author of All the President's Money: How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. This is her first book and is a high net worth financial planner. She has a BA in history, is a Juris Doctor, and is even a contributor to Forbes. What a fascinating bio. Megan, thanks so much for being here.
Evan, I'm so excited to be here. I got to tell you, I know you're going to interview me, but I want to interview you about all the authors you've spoken to because you've
Anytime,
you've spoken to everybody.
anytime you want, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
Before we start all that, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Being president is a mixed bag. There are 20-hour days, mistakes you make can get people killed, and the voters can gleefully boot you from office. But many presidents who have gone through those things have also helped people in need, for instance. They've earned the respect of the world, and these days, they can earn the prettiest of pennies after leaving office. Their net worths soar as they sign book deals, give paid speeches, and recently, they've even endorsed trinkets that were ordinarily reserved for infomercials. But it wasn't always like this. Early American presidents often lived out their lives in debt. So, Megan, when and how did you realize that understanding their money is the key to understanding them?
Well, it's funny. So first of all, I've loved the presidents since I was 6 years old. I grew up in a small town and I would be that kid that would go right into the school library and grab the books on the presidents. I think they always resonated with me because when you grow up in a small town, you realize that a lot of them are from small towns. And the idea of leaving your small town and going on this journey, right? The hero's journey sort of captures your imagination as you're, a kid growing up. But, as time went on, I actually got into the tax world and the money world. I worked at Goldman and Bank of New York Mellon, and I worked with high net worth individuals, really wealthy people. And when you work with wealthy people, one of the first things you do is you sit down with them and you want to understand their story. Some of it is because you're trying to understand how they do problem solving, how they psychologically look at things. But I would hear these stories, they would explain, look, I was budgeting, I worked really hard. I, was able to get this opportunity. I took a chance. And then they always would say to me, and then I got a little lucky. So these characteristics sort of hung out there. And I read voraciously, right? I'm always with my Kindle on planes because I business travel. And so when I'm reading books in history, I always would see like something like so and so took this job or they would buy a house. And most of the time in history books, it's a sentence and they keep on moving, right? Because it's not the thing that captures you. But I know from living my financial life and working with clients that buying a house or changing jobs, the emotional turmoil that comes with that. And so I really was curious, like, who was good with money? Like, if I had to have them as a client, who would I want and who would I not want? And it was sort of fun to delve in then because what I learned in sort of looking at them and their finances is how incredibly human they all are. And even the ones like George Washington or, James Monroe, how incredibly modern their problems are if we were to hear them today.
You're used to sitting down and being able to talk to people and I guess interview them to figure out what services they need. Was it difficult for you to get inside these people's heads without being able to sit down with them and to use the public resources and information that's available?
Yeah. So you almost have to look at it as two groups, right? Anyone post HW, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, they're all, they still haven't all opened their records. They're all still pretty private, right? So you have to go into the public records and try to piece it together. But the ones who are before that, the good news is they used to be letter writers. And their wives used to be letter writers with their family. And so what was really interesting is going through primary source documents like insurance records, death records, letters between people, and start to pull things out. Like I got to look at a letter from Harry Truman to his wife Bess. And when you work with people in finance and you're working on estate plans, you always tell them to do a letter, right? Tell your beneficiaries, your heirs, what you were thinking. And in this letter that the Truman Library shared, and it had just been released in the past 10 years because the family had sealed it, he talks about what their net worth is and where the money is held and how he built it. And, Truman's he's, he's not a flowery speaking guy. He's pretty dry, like direct, and you can see like there's a sense of pride that he was able to build a net worth of $750,000, which in 1970s dollars probably is closer to $7 or $8 million today.
Hmm.
And it's unbelievable how he's sharing this to Bess. And anyone who studies Truman knows the one person he wanted to impress in life was Bess. He wanted to make her happy. And look, it took him a long time to win her, and he did a great job of building their wealth, but
uh,
keeping it very private.
the book focuses on 10 presidents, and I've got them written down here in the order that they served in office in chronologically, not in the order that you have them in. But you focused on Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Grant, Coolidge, Hoover, FDR, Eisenhower, LBJ, and Ford. What were the criteria for who you picked?
Yeah, and actually, I have a bunch more in there. I have Reagan in there. I have them all in there. So some of it is what I did is I looked at the traits my clients have to build wealth, right? People always want to know what the wealthy are doing. And I'll tell you, in working with high net worth individuals, just because they make high incomes doesn't mean they're able to build wealth. There's a lot more to it. So what I wanted to do in going through the stories was try to find stories of either where they failed or where they succeeded at the characteristic. So, for instance, Ronald Reagan is a good example. He was one of the ones I did early research on. And, I'll be candid, like I never really felt connected with him, but his story was very, very moving because who he was as a child and how he grew up is so different than the person we saw in the 1980s. To grow up the son of an alcoholic who had the family, basically leaving town in the middle of the night because they couldn't afford rent. That's a big thing.
And
And so
traumatic for someone. Yeah.
totally. And so Reagan sort of gravitated to his mother's nature with money, and Reagan became an amazing budgeter. And almost it was like a rigidness because and we all know people like this where they're almost compulsive in what they're doing because they're trying to stay on track. And so over the course of his life, he took risks and was able to build wealth, but you had to work within his framework. And unfortunately for Reagan, in his first marriage, he was attracted to a woman who was an incredible spender. And Jane Wyman, like Reagan, grew up poor, was an incredible success story, but she loved jewelry and dresses and furs. And when they got together, she talks about it in like Hollywood magazines. Ronnie puts me on a budget, right? I mean, she's complaining about him. It's like J-Lo before they divorced, J-Lo complaining about Ben, right? Like who does this? But it's because he really wanted them to be able to build wealth. And so together they decide they're going to buy a house. And remember, they're friends with all these Hollywood people. And they're, at this point, Jane Wyman didn't have her Oscar. Reagan was still a B-list actor. And so they wanted to buy a great house, but they're not going to be able to afford what like Bob Hope could afford, right? Or Clark Gable.
Right.
And so they basically find a piece of land. They come up with a very strict budget. They have a very tight mortgage, and they each get $25 a week to spend on whatever they want. And I think it's very endearing of Reagan, right? Like how he's just not who you see. It's not what you see when you see him in the 80s, right? Where
I'm
he's
jumping
he's
ahead a
already
little
built the
bit
wealth.
here.
Yeah.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but
Yeah.
does that foreshadow his conservative financial views politically?
I get asked this a lot. What impact their personal finances have on them politically and fiscally for the US government. I do think that the interesting thing with Reagan is he struggled over the course of his life with money, right? He was an actor, and then the studio system fell apart. He became the president of SAG. And then from that, he leveraged a relationship with Lou Wasserman to become the host of the GE Theater. Now, today we're like, the GE Theater, what is that? But back in the day, it would be like having an actor introduce the morning show or the Bear, right? And as part of his deal with GE, besides hosting this TV show, which was very prestigious, he traveled the country speaking. And I think in traveling the country and sort of taking these Reader Digest like ways of looking at the world, I do think it impacted him politically. And he was a strict budgeter. Look, I mean, if you think about who else was pretty strict is Calvin Coolidge, right? He was like, he called himself thrifty, and he would lecture the country on being thrifty in the roaring 20s, right? It's just, so sometimes it resonates with the American public and sometimes it doesn't. But it can impact them.
Your book opens with a description of FDR investing in a lobster business before his presidency. I had never heard that before. I guess that's why we needed your book, because I've read like 12 books on FDR or something like that. It reminds me though of Thomas Jefferson selling nails, Truman selling clothes, Carter with a peanut farm, the Clintons investing in the Whitewater land. They all seem to have this interest in investing and this ambition to make make a buck for themselves. Um, does that speak to an ambition that even the least effective presidents are born with? Is that
I
a
think it,
uniting thing?
yeah, I think it speaks to everything that all of us are interested in. All of us want to be the guy or gal that discovered some AI, invested in an AI company early, right? Or crypto, right? Think about people today and how we behave. Everybody wants to sort of be the one who brings in a great idea. And I think one of the things I would tell you in all of these different people, and I'll use the Clintons first, and then we'll talk about FDR, is one of the things that I found in studying their financial stories is when they didn't grow up in money, they often lacked certain skills to help them build it. Now, the Clinton thing becomes a big scandal, but when you get to the heart of what happened there, Bill Clinton had invested with the McDougalls earlier and had made $2,000 in the 70s. And it was a very much like a friendship. And he heard about this Whitewater thing. They ran into the McDougalls at a restaurant. They heard about this retirement community they were building in the Ozarks. It sounded great, and they invested in it. And they failed to do due diligence. And that's where people get burned financially, is they don't always ask the key questions that they should ask in order to make sure that they're making the best financial decisions. And in Bill Clinton's case, I think there's this need to be connected with people. And for him, doing due diligence could be difficult. And I would tell you, and I talk about this in the book, what's really interesting historically is we have three presidents born within 2 months of each other.
Yeah.
Donald Trump in June of
I love
46.
that fact. I love that fact. Yeah.
Yeah, George W. in July of 46 and Bill Clinton in August of 46. And it's because with the Bush and the Clinton side, their fathers came home from war. Operation Magic Carpet had happened 10 months earlier. And what's really interesting when you look at these three people, whether you like them or not, all incredibly charismatic. I know people who've met all three, and they all could just woo you. But when you think about Donald Trump, whether you like him or not, one of the things that I find striking about him, if you read The Art of the Deal, you watch The Apprentice, he's always asking questions. He's always pushing, pushing, pushing. That's his form of due diligence. And he often brings people in to help him with it. Bill Clinton would have been well served to have a little bit of that questioning when he went into Whitewater. So these are some of the things I see that they made mistakes on. Now, you asked me about FDR, and FDR is interesting because he's not like Clinton. He came from money, right? And, most of his money, while the Roosevelt side is a lot of, American aristocracy money, his real money came from his mother's side, the Delanos, right? And it came from the opium trade. And so it's funny, it took me a while to find a story on FDR. And FDR to me is a hard nut to crack. He's jovial, he's personality driven, and yet you can't get to him, right? And I know when working with wealthy people, there are some that are, generational wealth. They have that almost shell around them. But I was reading, and I forget where I read it, but I read a book and it said he invested in lobsters and dirigibles. And that was it. It was a quick sentence. So I was fascinated by this, couldn't find anything. So when I go to the FDR library, and I was telling you this story before we started taping, you go to the FDR library and people, you have to submit a list of what you want to go through. And, most people are like, I want to learn about the Depression, Social Security, World War II. And I'm like, I'm here for the lobsters, right? Like I was like, I want to know more about this. And they did have the file on the lobsters.
That's so
So what the lobsters are all about is FDR was a society guy, right? He was interested. He would take part in charity events, invest, and so on. And he had gotten wind of this idea in 1921 of this company that was going to be able to ship lobsters all around the country. And, lobsters are very much an East Coast thing. I say this because I live in California, but I'm from the East Coast. We don't eat lobster much on the West Coast. And it was going to be, so he invests in it in today what we would call a safe or a convertible note. And unfortunately, the game plan didn't work that well because when they first set up the business, they actually didn't talk to the lobster boat guys and ask them how they wanted to be paid. And if you're if you're a guy who's basically looking for lobsters, you want to be paid in cash up front. So the business struggled and struggled. Now, keep in mind, at this point in time, FDR gets polio. And we all know the story of, him in Campobello, and he's struggling, and they finally bring him back to New York. And, he's looking for a cure. And at the same time, Louis Howe, the journalist turned, political mastermind for FDR, he's the one writing the company, trying to figure out should they invest more to help save the company. So the documents I got to look through, which were fascinating, were a lot of letters from Louis Howe, really trying to solve the issues for FDR, who, as you and I know, is in the background, and he can't even get out of bed. And
amazing.
it sort of fascinates you because it makes you realize we focus so much on like one thing going on in a president's life, and we often forget there's a lot of other stuff going on in the background.
The presidents are on our money. What is the history of that, and how important is that?
It's funny. We have them on our money, but we don't think about who's on what, right?
Right.
They've been on our money for a very, very, very long time. And, I don't think that there's any real correlation to who's good with money, right? I mean,
Mm,
I'll tell you one thing. I wouldn't put Thomas Jefferson on anything if I was picking who was good with
right.
money, right? And Herbert Hoover should be like on the $1 million note, right? He was amazing with money. So I think the thing is, what is really important to focus on is the values that presidents had with money. And one of the things I struggled with in working on this project was the first, we had 12 slave owning presidents. So when I'm looking at these presidents and trying to figure out, okay, were they financially resilient, right? Which is the academic way of looking at personal finance. I could look at a George Washington and be like, wow, he is the total, he's the whole package. He understands budgeting, he has relationships, he's building wealth, he's marrying up, he's managing assets well, he's managing a very illiquid situation incredibly well while he's fighting a war.
It's
But
easy to do that when you've got free labor.
when you got free labor, exactly. And that was one of the struggles is you're reading this and you're like, look, he knows it's wrong. He knows it's wrong. He's successful with money, and I want to hold him up as an example, but he's a slave owner. And at the end of the day, he knew it was wrong, and he, while he struggled with it, he clearly didn't struggle enough because he kept slaves. And so what was really fascinating about Washington, as a side note, was he was an amazing estate planner. You don't think about it, but in those days, he had served as executor for a lot of people. He was used to legal documents, and he wrote his own estate plan and made a huge drafting error. He basically said, my slaves, not Martha's dower slaves, but my slaves could be freed when my wife passes. And of course, he predeceases her, and now Martha realizes she may be killed. And what's fascinating about this, and if you go to the Mount Vernon, they talk about the fact that there's an uprising, potentially to burn, to take Martha's life. But what I found fascinating in studying this is that Abigail Adams writes about this issue. We don't think about these women being contemporaries. And she goes and visits Martha Washington, who is stressed and has made the decision to sign manumission forms to release the slaves. And Abigail Adams writes a family friend saying, I saw Martha and she's not doing well, and she's doing this, but it's created incredible stress. And I find it fascinating because I know Abigail Adams was not a slave owner and not a fan of it. And, they all worked within this world together on how people's finances operated. So I know I just took you on a
No,
tangent, but
no, it's fascinating stuff. I want to ask you about more presidents, but I
yeah,
want to ask you about you also. Your
okay.
path, it seems fascinating. You went from history to law to financial journalist and now financial advisor and also historian now. How did all that happen?
It's funny. I've always loved history. My father was really into history, and so me and my two brothers are just huge history fans. I mean, I went to Gettysburg more before I was 10 years old than anywhere else. But I feel like it all does tie together. So I was a history major at Bryn Mawr College. I was medieval English and modern Chinese. And medieval England functions on estate planning, right? So much of U.S. tax and estate law, we look to British common law. So going into law was a very logical thing, and it was in law school that I realized I liked tax. And most people groan and they think, oh, income tax, estate tax, but income and estate tax are fascinating areas to work within because you're constantly problem solving and you really do need to understand history. Why do we do the things we do? And what are we trying to drive from a policy standpoint in the US? So, I've had that part of my life. And then out of law school, I got recruited by Goldman Sachs. I was there for 12 years. I was briefly at BNY Mellon, and now I have my own practice in San Francisco and in Irvine, although I work nationally, working with very wealthy families on all of their, tax, estate, investing, everything that touches them. And so, after doing it for 23 years and being so passionate about history and when you work with these families, by the way, you have to know history because you're constantly telling the story of where the US economy is and where international economies are, right? Like right now, the big story is we've been here before. 83% of all presidential election years, the S&P 500 ends up. So, it's history. So all of this has sort of come together because it's a lot of my passion in understanding. What was really interesting as I went through studying in the book and studying my clients is as I looked at opportunity sets that our presidents had, a lot of them grew up poor or not with not a lot of money, right? However you want to say it. And they were able to rise in the United States. So Richard Nixon, here in Orange County, grew up with a family. They own a grocery store and a gas station in Whittier, right? They don't have a lot of money. And he goes to college at Whittier College for, I believe, $230 a year, right? In the 1930s. And you think about that and you go, well, if I present value that number today, that's about $9,000.
Right.
How has it gotten where NYU today is $90,000, right?
100,000. Yeah.
Right. So you start to think about this and you think about the hurdles to climb on a socioeconomic level in the United States, and you realize people can still do it, but it is so much harder today. And so it makes me think about the way we function in the US. So if you don't file a tax return or have a credit score in the United States, you don't exist financially, right? And a lot of times people can't even do those two things. It might be easy to you or me, but there's a lot of people who can't even get a decent credit score. I mean, trust me, try to get a college kid a credit card today. It's very hard.
Interesting.
So yeah, which is funny because when I went to college, I ended up racking up all this credit card debt
Me
because
too.
we were given, right.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is, as you think about things historically, we're still functioning under rules that were set up in the 20s, the 40s, the 60s, right? So for instance, when you buy a house today, you need to have 20% down. Why? And the reason you start to figure this out is because back in the 50s and 60s, when, if a bank had to repossess your house, they often resold it at about 80 cents on the dollar. So that 20% down guaranteed they'd be made whole.
They'd be made
So,
even. Yeah.
yeah. So
Um,
so doesn't really make sense today when you look at history. So I know that's a very convoluted way to talk about my career path, but what I sort of see is all these different ways my life has gone, whether it's history, law, tax, my business, and the book, they all come together.
you work with people who have A, made it big on their own, and B, some have inherited their
Hmm.
money.
Hmm.
I'm just curious about them. What do they misunderstand about money, even people who have tons of it?
So people who have a lot of money, first of all, they can't talk about it. There's very few people who they can really open up to, because if someone has $10 million, but they're struggling financially, and they can struggle financially, people roll their eyes and be like, yeah, you really got problems. I've had people who work for me say, I'm surprised how stressed some of our clients get. They're very wealthy. But the biggest challenge I think you see with people is discipline. So, and I broke the book up this way, but one of the biggest pieces of discipline is the ability to budget and the ability to connect with your future self. So, who is Evan in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And in order to help him, can you put a framework about your income and your spending today to be able to save for him? And so that's where it sounds crazy, but I spend a lot of time with my clients working on their spending patterns because, more money, more problems, right? And it's, and what people don't realize also is if you are the wealthy person in your family, right? And you've got siblings, cousins, nieces, and nephews, and they don't have that kind of money, you are often the backstop. And so they're often helping different family members all the time. So there's a lot of pressure on them.
How would you improve financial education in this country for young people?
So I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Financial Education. So it's a big
So
question,
I hope
right?
you, yeah.
Because we do focus on school. But here's what I would tell you is financial literacy, financial education, and the ability to achieve financial resiliency is a lifelong journey. I think it's important in school to learn the framework, learn how to budget, learn how to do a tax return, understand basic investing, do the calculation for taking student loans, understand how to buy a house, right? These basic things. But it can't just be you teach people to 18 and then you say, okay, good luck, have at it. You know, because it's like a muscle that you have to constantly be flexing. So I think that we need to look more to create a system where we're constantly having financial discussions. And some of those ways you can build them in your life is working with someone, working, and in particular, when you get married, working with your spouse. I will tell you half the time I'm a marriage counselor
Mm.
because spouses see differently. And I talk about this in the book. When you think about presidents like JFK and Jackie Kennedy, right? Or Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln, there is a lot of push pull in those relationships in regards to spending. One of the things I found fascinating was JFK, as you know, and you told me before the podcast, he's your favorite. He always donated his governmental salaries to charity. And it turned out one day in like 1962, it's in the newspaper, and Jackie had no idea that he was doing this. And I'm thinking, girl, you've been married to him for like almost 10
Yeah.
years.
Must
How
be
do you
nice
not
to
know
not even
this?
know that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, he's stressed because the shopping bills are coming in and, he's trying to manage that. And then, he's also trying to manage the White House because what most people don't realize is the presidents have to pay for the
Yeah.
expenses of living in the White House, and they all complain about it. And so I talk about this in the book, but JFK used to say to the butlers in the White House, listen, at a reception, don't just keep topping off the champagne glasses. Let's make sure let's make sure they're drinking the whole glass. Use up the half bottles because he doesn't want to have to pay for this.
That's
And that
awesome.
struggle. So when you think about it, these people like JFK worrying about money, Washington trying to deal with liquidity. These guys were always working on their financial literacy over the course of their life. And they were fortunate because they kept flexing their muscles. They kept learning the skills to get better and better and better. And if you ask me who was the sort of goat is of all the presidents financially, would be Herbert Hoover. And people are always floored because they think of him as one of our worst presidents. But Hoover was not only amazing with money, but he was a really amazing person and a wonderful humanitarian. But it gets overlooked because of those 4 years.
Yeah. Inconveniently, I guess, for him. All right, I want to go through a few of the presidents.
Okay, okay,
Um,
sorry, I
yeah,
keep taking you on tangents.
no, I want to go through. JF, I was going to do Lincoln first, but I want to start
Okay,
with JFK because you
yeah,
just mentioned JFK.
yeah,
The thing that I find so interesting about him is sort of what you're hinting on there, is that he had this sort of conscience going off in his head that even though he had all this money, there's no need to be flashy about it, not showy. And I love the fact that he, even when they would go out for beers, it was like couple beers and that's it. We're not going to go blow our money at all the nightclubs in town. How did that speak to this fascinating character that JFK had in his brain?
yeah. First of all, the presidential libraries, a lot of them have oral histories, and I'm reading them, right? And these are friends, so they're being asked questions, and they're just speaking, about topics. And Billings, who was JFK's best friend, it tells this story. They're in college, they're in New York for the summer, and the Stork Club is the hottest place in town. And the Stork Club used to, it'd be bottles, what we would call bottle service today. There would be balloons that rained down with prizes. There were beautiful women. And Lem Billings did not have the money that JFK had. And so they would go, they'd get a table, they'd order a cocktail, and then they'd be like, we'll be right back. And they'd sneak down the street and slam back some beers that were much cheaper. And I loved this about Kennedy because one of the things I've learned about wealthy people is they can be incredibly frugal, right? There's a reason they have money sometimes. It's they're thinking about just because you have money doesn't mean you're going to spend it like a drunken sailor. And Kennedy's very aware of money, right? In terms of, and when they interviewed Pierre Salinger and all of these people that work with him on the campaigns, they all said, look, he was very aware of a buck. He was very, very money conscious. But then you read in the oral histories, the maids that at the Kennedy compound always talked about, yeah, he'd come off the boat and he'd take his clothes off and he would just leave a pile of dirty clothes as he went. He didn't care. And what we realize is some of the things that we love about Kennedy, the crispness, the dress, Jackie really helped him with that. She styled him because he had that casualness that sometimes wealthy people have about things like clothing.
Too much of a boy, I guess, right?
Yeah, and just it wasn't what he prioritized, right?
Yeah.
He prioritized different things. I think she was an incredible asset. And one of the things you have to understand is clothing is a lot about building wealth, right? And not to hop away from Kennedy, but like the thing I found most fascinating about Martin Van Buren, who we don't really talk about a lot, but
Yeah.
he's the little magician's cool. But he really transformed himself from a poor innkeeper's son to eventually a lawyer to eventually a politician by learning how to dress. And that seems unbelievable to me that he could literally climb the socioeconomic ladder by just learning to dress like an attorney.
What about Chester Arthur? I love the fact that he was so into being fancy and these big furs and he was into big steak dinners and everything. Talk
Yes.
about
And
him.
oh my God. So so he was in a chapter that had to get cut from the book. So I've got all these
Uh,
chapters of all these other
Too
stories.
bad.
Chester Arthur's an interesting guy because he owned a lot of pair of pants, right? He's very fancy, he's very dapper, and he comes from this incredibly austere background. Father was a preacher, they didn't have a lot of money. And what he's very interesting about is he saw the good life and he worked very hard at using relationships to leverage up. So he was a good-looking guy. I know we look at him today with his
Yeah.
like mutton chops, and we're like, who
Yeah.
who would have worn that? But he
Yeah.
was stylish. He was attractive in the time period. And so he was able to come out of school. He was a teacher at first, then becomes a lawyer, and he gets connected in a big law firm because of a relationship his father has. And through that, he makes political connections. And he's very focused on building wealth. And he marries a wealthy woman, and they buy this huge brownstone in New York. He joins the private clubs. He's into the lifestyle. And it's really interesting in how he does that because it's really because he's the master of all relationships. And when you look at how he built wealth, it's almost hard to put your finger on it because it was becoming friends with Roscoe Conkling, right? And becoming named a shipmaster and being charge of the port in New York City. And he was doing things that today would look a little corrupt and shady. But again, that's how he leveraged himself. He created himself. And there's something with some of these presidents. Martin Van Buren's a good example, Chester Arthur. They created a character of themselves that pulled them up to be who they wanted to be. And a lot of it came from just the image. If you saw Chester Arthur, you'd be like, that guy is going somewhere.
Hmm. Going from some of the least known presidents, Arthur Van Buren, to the best known president, Abraham Lincoln. You say he was
Yes.
amazing with personal finances. He started out poor, wound up relatively financially secure. Hard to deny that. What did you discover about his financial strategy? And of course, he was known as a brilliant political tactician and still
Mhm.
is. How did that translate to his financial personal
Yeah.
life?
So I'll tell you one thing. People say, "How did you get the idea for the book?" I had the idea and I went to Springfield, Illinois. And before I had gone to the town that had the log cabin that he lived in. If you've ever been there, it's striking. And then you go 20 miles to Springfield and they take you on the tour and they show you his house. And it's the nicest house in town. And then you realize he made that jump in 10 years. And you're like, how did he do that? So, first of all, Lincoln's a good example of the master of the pivot. Lincoln failed a lot financially in the beginning. He did not come from money. He did not see himself as a wealthy man. He made mistakes in the businesses he invested in. He owed people money. He got sued for money. He made every mistake he could make, but he was a very learning being. And that is important as you're trying to understand money. I talked earlier in the show about when I was in college, I racked up all this credit card debt. It made me a very conscious person in the fact that I didn't want that to happen again. And I see that with Lincoln, right? But Lincoln does something that's really interesting. And a number of the great presidents did the same thing. And don't laugh, but Lincoln married up. And he did that in the same vein as his hero, George Washington, right? So he doesn't have a Harvard education. He doesn't have all the connections. He's working his way up in Springfield and he gets introduced to Mary Todd, who is father's a wealthy Lexington, landholder and slaveholder. And that marriage helps propel him up. And as he propels up, what you realize is who you marry is very important on if you can build wealth. So Mary Todd gave him access to a higher echelon of society, but she also came with a lot of financial issues. And for whatever reason, whether it was a personality disorder, whether it was diabetes unchecked, whether she just was a very fickle woman, she spent money like water. It was crazy, her spending. And so sometimes you find when you're in that situation, you become contrast. So she's spending, he's saving. And that's one of the interesting things you see in his money is he's always very aware that he can't control her. He can't change her. And remember, they go through a lot of trauma. They lose children and so on. But he tries to control what he can control. And so when he leaves Springfield, when he wins the presidency, he's worth about $15,000. And he takes the house in Springfield. He hires a guy to rent it out. And he goes to Washington. And as we know, the war is starting. And the U.S. Treasury decides to issue Treasury bonds and notes. The bonds were paying about 6%. The notes were paying about 7 1/3, right? And Lincoln takes a piece of every paycheck and he saves it in the Treasury notes. So he's being conservative, right? He's parking money away, parking money away. And at the same time, Mary Todd's running off to New York. She's off spending money, right? She's getting into trouble. And what's fascinating is when he dies, first of all, when you die and you're assassinated as a president, you are paid through that last day. All of them, Garfield, Kennedy, Lincoln, all got paid through the last day. But
But that's
he
it. They
was
don't get paid for the rest of the term. Interesting.
no.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
It's not
And
like a
then
baseball contract.
it's not, and back then they didn't even have pensions.
Right, right.
And so what's really interesting with Lincoln when he dies, he's worth about 85,000 or about $2 million today, right? So what I found always striking in Lincoln's story is he does a very good job at building wealth, but there's almost what I found really, and I've run into this with clients at times, where somebody's sick with a terminal illness and you can't get them to do their estate plan. This is a man who had visions of death, right? He has a lot of these, he just really dark thoughts, and he's an attorney. And what is the one thing he doesn't have? He doesn't have a will. So when he dies, Robert Lincoln has to write the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to say, come help us. Come help us gather the assets. And because he doesn't have an estate plan, Mary Todd Lincoln only gets the spousal share. So a third of the estate to Mary Todd Lincoln, a third of the estate to Robert, and a third of the estate to Tad. And that's how they break the estate up. So Lincoln was very good with money, great with building wealth. But if he was here today, I'd say, why didn't you do an estate plan? Or did we just not find it? Like, it was so odd that he didn't have one.
One thing that's super fun about this episode is we're just jumping around from president to president, no matter the
Totally.
time period. It's so much fun. All right. Have you heard the video or the audio of LBJ ordering pants?
No, but I
Okay,
gotta hear this.
it's
Okay, give it to
wonderful
me.
audio. I guess I guess I could play it on this if I was going to. But I'll just tell you that he orders 6 pairs of pants and discusses himself in relatively crude fashion. Uh, my wife and
Not
I just,
shocking.
yeah, not shocking. My wife and I just listened to it. We were rolling in laughter. But you say that and he orders, the reason I'm bringing it up is because he ordered 6 pairs of pants on this phone call. Not one, not two. He ordered 6 pairs. You say that he worried about money, but blew lots of money. Uh, what does that say about this guy who passed all these incredible bills and laws, and some people have criticized him for being a big spender? Is there any parallel there?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't, first of all, people ask me a lot, do their personal finances impact fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is created by thousands of people in the US government. I think LBJ is just a lot like all of us, right? So I talk about this in the book, but there's a letter in the early 40s where he basically is writing a friend and he's like, I waked up at 2 a.m. worried about money. And then in the next line, he's like, I need to buy this suit. And it's a suit the equivalent of $4,000 today. I think we all have that yin yang in us, of just trying to manage wanting something and that instant gratification, plus being worried about money. And that to me is more about a common human emotion than anything about LBJ. I think it just makes him who he is and more personal and more human. And look, I mean, he's another one who marries up, right? He marries Lady Bird, who had an inheritance. um
And then
but
they
I think
invested in those radio stations also.
they invest in the radio stations, and she's pretty savvy with money. Look, there's a lot of political, oh, he took advantage and so on with the radio stations, but at the end of the day, you had to have the money to buy the radio station, and she had it. And she had it with property she inherited. So what we have to keep in mind is when you inherit an asset, unless you commingle it, it is separate property and is not marital property. So I think with LBJ, I found with him a very human part of the emotion, and not someone who was crazy extravagant. Now, if you want to talk about somebody who, liked to spend, I would tell you, I would look more towards people like Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson, like Washington, was incredibly illiquid, but Jefferson loved the finer things in life, and he was unable to restrain himself, right? And we all do this with money. We all want to buy that really nice thing, the nice car, the nice clothing, the nice jewelry. But a lot of people can restrain themselves and other people can't. And I would tell you that LBJ, sometimes he would treat himself and sometimes he wouldn't, right? Whereas Jefferson was like, bring on the Parmesan cheese, bring the wine order in. Hey, let's bring this in so we can make ice cream, right? I mean, Jefferson is all of our worst impulses about money tied up in a brilliant philosopher. And I ask myself sometimes, if I could have written and thought like Jefferson, would I give up my ability to be good with money for that? I don't know. It might be a pretty fair trade,
That's
right?
all right.
But
Um,
but but it's I always feel bad for the three of them, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, the troika there. And poor Monroe. He's always good looking guy, right? But like compared to the other two, he's smart, but he's not them. But they all just struggled with illiquidity. But Jefferson, I'll just tell you this one quick story. Jefferson had this great idea and I love it because I think about it with my friends. He wanted Monroe to buy this piece of land next to him so that they were retired, they could all hang out all the time. And I totally love that idea because it's like, oh, how nice, right? Like the idea of like some of your closest friends who challenge your thinking on the plot of land next door is lovely. And Monroe does it. He does buy the land, which he shouldn't have. But
Interesting.
again, yeah.
Um, Hillary, I mean, again, we're just jumping around from place to place here.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton, when they left the White House, the Clintons, um, she got in trouble because she said, you don't realize we were flat broke when we
Mhm.
left the White House. On the one hand, their legal bills, his legal bills, certainly piled up big time. But
Mhm.
on the other hand, she seemed to ignore their massive earning potential. And in the end, of course, they would earn tons of money from speeches and whatever else, investments,
Mhm.
buying houses. Um, what does that transformation tell you from being sort of, living on what was essentially government housing for their
Mhm.
entire careers to suddenly being able to have this massive earning potential? How does that show the change in history from what presidents used to be able to do for what they can do in modern times?
Yeah. So look, Hillary Clinton may have just been speaking from a point of anxiety. Like we all know they have earning potential, but she didn't, she actually has to execute on it, right? Because we're going to judge her if she's going to be able to make money or not, because we do judge about money. But, Clinton, Obama, Biden, Trump, they all owe, homage to the grand master of it all, which is Jerry Ford. And I loved researching Jerry Ford. I always feel bad for him because he was president for 2 years. They all say it takes 2 years to master it. And then he, of course, has to leave office. But Jerry Ford was young when he finished, and he had always been in Congress, never expected to be president. And when he gets out, like in his oral history testimony, he says, I'm a capitalist, damn it. I'm going to go do something. And so, like presidents before him, like Johnson, Truman, Eisenhower, although Eisenhower writes his book before he's president, he and Betty get book deals and he hates debt. I mean, his daughter talks about in her oral history. She would try to explain mortgages and leveraging to her dad, and he'd be like, no, no, no debt. I'm going to pay it all off. But what was interesting about Ford is he realized that the opportunity set had changed. And after he basically was, it's hard because Ford, we forget this, but Ford was at one point pitched to be a co-president with Reagan. That was debated during the 1980 presidential convention. I mean, it sounds crazy to us now, but it was a legitimate idea. But Ford was sort of looking at all opportunities. And what's really interesting is he had Hollywood agents helping him. So in 1976, when they were planning the bicentennial, he got to know a lot of Hollywood people, including an agent named Norman Brokaw. And so Brokaw had helped him during the campaign to bring celebrities in to endorse him and so on. But after he lost, Brokaw was part of a team that was going to help him create the next chapter. And there was a lot of things he could do. And, a lot of these things he did do. He wrote a book, he did speaking engagements, he did charity work, he ends up going on boards. But Ford makes one misstep, which today would be a blip for us, which is he decides to partner with the Franklin Mint on a series of medals depicting the presidency. And when these medals come out, the press just is like, how tacky.
That
Like, what are
sounds
you doing?
familiar.
Right. Now I'm thinking, oh, wait, like Donald Trump is like pitching wine. So, like, times have changed.
And
So,
digital
at the
trading
time,
cards.
right, right. And so, Ford never does anything like that again where he's endorsing a product. He sort of learns that's a bridge too far for the American public in the 70s and 80s. But what's really interesting, and one of his assistants says, look, sometimes she always felt like people might have been pushing him too hard on some of this stuff. when he took that risk. But one of the things that struck me is in Sandy Weil's oral history at the Ford Library, and he was the chairman of Citigroup and so on, Smith Barney and then Citigroup, is he says, look, when Jerry Ford joined the board, the experience he brought, the viewpoint in managing a multinational Fortune 500 company was unbelievable.
Hmm.
And he was worth every penny. And it's interesting because at the end of the day, we sometimes now we give the presidents a hard time for doing this, but we have to remember in Washington, Jefferson's time, most people became president. I'm not in Jefferson's case, but they died right after,
Right.
right? And here you've got guys living 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I
They
mean,
have great experience and they should tap into it.
how complicated was it for you to research Donald Trump? And I ask, on the one hand, he's been bankrupt several times. He is accused of laundering money through his apartment buildings from the Russian government in the 80s. Um, and at the same time, we really don't know what's in his taxes. Those have
Mhm.
still not been released. So how much of a dichotomy is that? And I know it's tough to talk about people who are right there on the stage right now.
Mhm.
But what was it like trying to figure out what the actual core of Donald Trump's financial mindset is, given there's such a big mystery there?
Yeah. So, you have to make a decision when you're writing a book where it's all the presidents about Trump because he's quicksand. And you could have completely fallen into that quicksand. I actually think there's a book coming out right now about some of his
Yeah,
finances.
next week. Yeah.
Um, so I think the thing about Trump that I made a decision about was I have read enough about his finances. If he released his tax return, most people can't understand it, right? That's the thing. His stuff is very, very complex. The New York Times did a great series a few years back on some of his estate planning. Donald Trump, and remember, my book is about the characteristics of money. It is not political. It's about financial resiliency and how people manage their money. So, what I look at with both Trump and Biden, because they're both divisive for people, is one, they're both sort of not that interesting in a weird way. But Trump does take a lot of advice on the tax front and the estate front. He has advisors who are giving him the concepts. What Trump does that makes it go a little bit too far is he pushes the limit, right? So there's a technique I do it with clients called grantor retained annuity trusts. Not to get too technical on everybody, they're called grats. You put assets into a trust, and at the end of a period of time, you take back the original assets and you pass the appreciation. He's done those things, but you have to value the assets if you're using private assets. His valuations were a little aggressive. Well, actually, they were aggressive. But here's the deal. The IRS audited him and yeah, they changed the valuations a little, but they didn't change, like they didn't disallow it. So the thing is he pushes the envelope and the bigger question is not Trump's finances, but we have built so much trust into our uh, financial institutions. And the question is, do they have the teeth to keep people in line? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
like if I file a tax return and I'm able to take a position and then the statute of limitations passes and the service or the state revenue bureau doesn't come and audit it, then it passes. So and I think about this a lot, which is Trump is merely taking advantages at times of the weaknesses in the system. So that's the thing about his finances. So is there a learning lesson there? I think the things to learn from Trump is don't be afraid to embrace risk, right? He's not. And most Americans are incredibly risk adverse. And the other thing with Trump is do your due diligence and have advisors. He's good with that stuff. He's good with positioning it. But, is there something to really hold up as a great example? I just don't find him interesting. And I'm being completely honest.
Yeah.
It's just not that fun.
What do you hope voters take away from this book as they make their decisions on who they're going to vote for president?
So first of all, I love history and I hate the divisiveness that's there today. And I've tried to be non-political in this book, But I think the thing is, there are people in this book that you would never vote for who you will love financially. And there are people who you love politically who are a train wreck financially. So there's just a humanity that is in all of these people. And that's the thing about history. We're trying to find the person amongst all the documents. So, when I'm looking at the four candidates today, right? Trump, Vance, Harris, and Walz, I find them fascinating from a financial perspective. And I'll just give this to you really fast. Walz is all about security. He's a lot like the average American. He's prioritized pensions, right? He's a teacher, right? He knew he was never, I mean, now he's going to make a lot of money whether they win or lose because they'll get the book deal, right? So he's got the golden ticket. But 30, 40 years ago, he didn't think that. He took a lot of secure routes. And a lot of that makes sense because he lost his father at an early age. And remember, he and his wife have, whatever their fertility treatments were, they still had to spend money on it. We all know how stressful that is. And so they picked a lot of security. You've got on the other side, you've got Trump. He's very aggressive. He's generational wealth. His job financially was his father's job was to get the money from the father to Donald Trump's kids. Donald Trump's job is to get his money to his grandchildren. That's how it works technically in wealth planning. And he's doing that. He's doing it with aggressive risk, with techniques. And guess what? He gets access to a section of the tax code that most Americans can't access because he's in real estate. And then you've got Vance and Harris. And Harris is a good example of the good little Girl Scout. Everything is conflict free. It's very organized. It's very diversified. You can clearly see the line. Her portfolio is chugging along, probably making 6 or 7% a year
And she
annualized.
released years of tax returns.
Yes. And if you look at her tax returns over the period of time, as her jobs have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, her taxes have gotten less and less, have gotten more and more conflict free. So when she became vice president, her husband still was a partner at a big law firm and they didn't want to lose him. Then, once she became vice president, he gave up all the partnership interest and he's a professor at Georgetown. So it's interesting because her portfolio is incredibly conflict free. And then you can see in her disclosures, her estate plan, which complies with California probate rules. Vance is interesting, and I'll use him as the last example because he's like a lot of our presidents in the past. Grew up poor, managed to get access to higher education, Yale Law, where he built crazy relationships like Amy Chua and, Peter Thiel and all these people, becomes a book author and a venture capitalist and makes money on a book. And you work with authors. So, none of us make money on books. A few do, but most don't.
Yeah.
And, what happens with Vance, which is interesting, is with each step, he can be more aggressive and take more risk. So his portfolio is a collection of his life experiences with owning single stocks or venture funds and so on. And he does something that a lot of the big politicians have done over the course of U.S. history. He marries up. By all accounts, his wife was more successful than him, came from a wealthier family than him. She's a very, very successful woman. And so he's an interesting one to look at, even though, he sort of picks on my demographic because I'm child free. So they're interesting, right? And so I will tell you this, most Americans look at them and everybody wants to be Donald Trump or JD Vance, but most Americans should want to be Kamala Harris financially. I'm not saying politically, I'm saying financially. Slow, stable, growing assets at a reasonable rate of return.
What can readers take away from, I guess you just sort of answered it there. What can readers take away from this book that will improve their own financial lives?
I want people to understand it's really hard to build wealth in this country today. I'm not saying the dream is impossible, but it's gotten a lot harder than it ever was in the past. And so when you're struggling to get the down payment to buy a house, or you're self-employed and the bank's saying we won't give you a loan because we want a W-2, or you don't have enough money to put in your 401k because you're trying to pay the bills. This is the challenge we have today. So as you think going forward about the direction this country needs to go in, think about the fact that we want to take a path where maybe our institutions are able to change to reflect who we really are. And I'll tell you one last thing, and it always sticks with me, but after World War II, Dwight Eisenhower went back to his hometown in Abilene, Kansas, where he grew up very poor. And he made a statement. He said, I found out after I grew up that we were really poor, but that the glory of America is we didn't know it then. All we knew that our parents could say to us was that the opportunity was all about us. All we had to do was reach out and take it. And I think about that, and I really hope we can get back to that point for more Americans over the next decade.
You dedicated this book to your husband and to your nephew, and you wished
Yes.
for your nephew the hurdles in life to make him ambitious, but that the hurdles would not be too high to keep him from the American dream. Why did you say that?
I think that my nephew is he's 5. He's in kindergarten, and I think for this next generation there's going to be some tough decisions. I think we need to change how we look at education, the cost of education. Is it worth it? I think we've got to think about what's happening in this country. We're short 5 million housing units, right? The divisiveness in this country. America works when the middle class exists, and the middle class today is in crisis. Getting a house, educating your children, buying groceries, it's gotten harder and harder. We need to start problem solving for this. And people always say, well, how do you expect to do it? And the one area I would always tell people is the tax code. The tax code is one of the most useful tools that we have to push Americans forward. So really learn how to file your taxes, how to maximize your tax breaks, what the code is trying to do. And so I do worry about kids like my nephew today. And then I'll say in the dedication of my husband's been living with the presidents for 4 years. God bless him. He's a chemical engineer. He is like, who are all these men in your life,
Did he at
And
least get to travel with you to some of this stuff?
yes, yes,
That's
yes.
nice.
And it's funny. I haven't asked him who his favorite is yet. Because, when I would get into a president, I'd become obsessed with that one. And like they became my friend. So I think he's just like, oh my goodness, I'm so tired of the presidents.
Are you ever going to be crazy enough to write another book?
Yeah, I do. I do. I want to see how this goes. This has been a huge learning experience about myself, about how I think. And you asked Lindsay, who wrote the
Chervinsky.
book Chervinsky, thank
Yeah.
you, on John Adams. I want to see where this takes me. You know what I mean? Putting your thoughts out there for the world to judge you on is incredibly stressful, but it's also incredibly freeing because I have it out there now. So I'm curious to see where this adventure goes, And if anyone asks my dream job, I want to run the IRS. I'd be really good at that.
I promise if
So
I get elected president one day, and I'm not running for anything, I will pick you to run the IRS. Is a president allowed to pick?
awesome.
Is that an appointment? I don't even know.
It's an appointment, yes, and there's a whole process, but yeah, it is something that the administration has influence on. Yes,
Well, yeah, on that other stuff you said about being yourself, I always say to people who ask me about being a reporter, I just go on and I am who I am.
exactly, exactly. So,
Megan
well,
Gorman, the author of All the President's Money, How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. Thank you so much for being with us.
oh my God, thank you for having me.
So much fun. Check out the book and her website, which is allthepresidentsmoney.com. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Megan_E_Gorman. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.